The Death of the Author, written by Roland Barthes in 1967. In his story, Saracen, Balzac, speaking of a castrato disguised as a woman, writes this sentence: "It was woman, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring and her delicious delicacy of feeling." Who is speaking this way? Is it the story's hero, concerned to ignore the castrato concealed beneath the woman? Is it the man, Balzac, endowed by his personal experience with a philosophy of women? Is it the author, Balzac, professing certain literary ideas of femininity? Is it universal wisdom or romantic psychology? It will always be impossible to know, for the good reason that all writing itself, this special voice, consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. Probably this has always been the case. Once an action is recounted for intransitive ends, and no longer in order to act directly upon reality, that is finally external to any function, but the very exercise of the symbol, this disjunction occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters his own death. Writing begins. Nevertheless, the feeling about this phenomenon has been variable. In primitive societies, narrative is never undertaken by a person, but by a mediator, shaman, or speaker, whose performance may be admired, that is, his mastery of the narrative code, but not his genius. The author is a modern figure, produced no doubt by our society insofar as, at the end of the Middle Ages, with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual, or, to put it more nobly, of the human person. Hence, it is logical that with regard to literature, it should be positivism, resume, and the result of capitalist ideology, which has accorded the greatest importance of the author's person. The author still rules in manuals of literary history, in biographies of writers, in magazine interviews, and even in the awareness of literary men, anxious to unite, by their private journals, their person and their work. The image of literature to be found in contemporary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his history, his tastes, his passions. Criticism still consists, most of the time, in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of the man Baudelaire, Van Gogh's work, his madness, Tchaikovsky's, his vice. The explanation of the work is always sought in the man who has produced it, as if, through the more or less transparent allegory of fiction, it was always finally the voice of one and the same person, the author, which delivered his confidence. Though the author's empire is still very powerful, recent criticism has often merely consolidated it. It is evident that for a long time now, certain writers have attempted to topple it. In France, Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and foresee in its full extent the necessity of substituting language itself for the man who hitherto was supposed to own it. For Mallarmé, as for us, it is language which speaks, not the author. To write is to reach, through a pre-existing impersonality, never to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realistic novelist, that point where language alone acts, performs, and not oneself. Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author for the sake of the writing, which is, as we shall see, to restore the status of the reader. Valéry, encumbered with a psychology of the self, greatly adulterated Mallarmé's theory, but turning in a preference for classicism to the lessons of rhetoric, he unceasingly questioned and mocked the author, emphasizing the linguistic and almost chance nature of his activity, and throughout his prose works championed the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which any recourse to the writer's inferiority seemed to him pure superstition. It is clear that Proust himself, despite the apparent psychological character of what is called his analyses, undertook the responsibility and of inexorably blurring by an extreme subtilization the relation of the writer and his characters, by making the narrator not the person who has seen or felt, nor even the person who writes, but the person who will write, the young man of the novel. But, in fact, how old is he, and who is he? Wants to write, but cannot. And the novel ends when at last the writing becomes possible. Proust has given modern writing its epic by a radical reversal. Instead of putting his life into his novel, as we say so often, he makes his very life into a work for which his own book was in a sense the model, so that it is quite obvious to us that it is not Charles who imitates Montesquieu, but that Montesquieu, in his anecdotal historical reality, is merely a secondary fragment derived from Charles. Surrealism, lastly, to remain on the level of this prehistory of modernity. Surrealism doubtless could not accord language a sovereign place, since language is a system, and since what the movement sought was, romantically, a direct subversion of all codes, an illusory subversion. Moreover, for a code cannot be destroyed. It can only be played with, but by abruptly violating expected meanings. This was the famous surrealist jolt, by entrusting to the hand of the responsibility of writing as fast as possible what the head itself ignores. This was automatic writing. By accepting the principle and the experience of a collective writing, surrealism helps secularize the image of the author. Finally, outside of literature itself, actually these distinctions are being superseded, linguistics has just finished the destruction of the author with a precious analytic instrument by showing that utterance in its entirety is a void process, which functions perfectly without requiring to be filled by the person of the interlocutors. Linguistically, the author is never anything more than the man who writes, just as I is no more than the man who says I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and this subject, void outside of the very utterance which defines it, suffices to make language work, that is, to exhaust it.